Thanks for joining us once again. This is part 2 of episode 6 of the History Hour. This is part 6 of our Mesopotamian series, where we'll be talking about the Neo-Assyrian Empire and the Neo-Babylonian at the end. If you haven't seen part 1, check that. And if you want to see the rest of them leading up to this final climactic end of the Mesopotamian civilization, check parts 1 through 5.
One of the great ironies of Tiglath-Pileser III isn't just the fact that he dies 1 year after his grandest triumph, conquering Babylon and making himself its king. It's that this man, who probably did as much, if not more, than any other early Neo-Assyrian monarch to build their empire into what it was, to establish Assyrian power, the dynasty he creates by usurping his predecessors doesn't actually last that much longer after him. Around the year 726 B.C.E., Shalmaneser V, the son of Tiglath-Pileser III, assumes the crown of Assyria. But he only reigns for 4 years, and the years of his reign are actually, in some ways, relatively obscure. Not much was written about him, all told. The only thing we can say for an absolute fact is that at some point during this, a man known as Hosea, the king of Israel, decided to revolt against Assyrian control, and the Assyrians being the Assyrians, Shalmaneser wouldn't let that pass, and so he marshaled his armies, and he rushed out to besiege the kingdom and teach this uppity king exactly what the price of disobedience to the Assyrians actually was. But as far as we know, this siege seems to have stretched out for years. And in the middle of it, around the year 722 BCE, a relatively obscure figure rises up and deposes Shalmaneser and makes himself the king, assuming the title of Sargon, or Sharukin II. And for those of you who remember our earlier episodes, Sargon roughly means legitimate king, which is a fairly telling title for an usurper to take, all told. And it's suspected that he probably finished the siege, though we're not entirely certain if it was him or Shalmaneser that actually did.
As we indicated, if you're familiar with some of the Old Testament stuff, this is the point in which the Bible is referencing the Assyrians. In 2 Kings, Assyria under Shalmaneser ends up attacking and devastating the northern kingdoms of Israel. And this is the period about in which they deport and scatter some of these people. During the Israeli revolt we've talked about, Sargon II crushed the revolt, and he himself recorded that he deported 27,900 of the Israelites to eastern Assyria. Later in the history, Sargon II's successor, Sennacherib, ends up also devastating Judea after they stopped paying him tribute. He records that he devastated and destroyed 46 of their cities before besieging Jerusalem itself.
Well, after this victory, Sargon II returns to Assyria to assume power, as it were, with the military behind him and a grand triumph supporting him. I don't think anyone was too willing to question his legitimacy as king at that point. And he will end up reigning for about 17 years. While Sargon II and the dynasty he founds, often referred to as the House of Sargon of Assyria, will oversee the Neo-Assyrian Empire becoming the largest, most powerful it had ever been. In some ways, we could also say that Sargon is kind of the beginning of the end for the empire as well. There'll be forces at play behind the scenes that ultimately will undermine the empires. You see, one of the biggest threats that Sargon and his successors will face is a new and dangerous alliance. Assyrians were not exactly a well-loved people in the neighborhood, and many ultimately chose to work against them. The Egyptians had managed to regain some of their stability and some of their standing, and they managed, again, not exactly quite where they had been before the Bronze Age collapse, but beginning to be sort of a power in the neighborhood once again. And the pharaohs have long cherished this ambition of reestablishing their control of the Mediterranean coast up through Syria, capturing the valuable sources of stone, metal, and timber in Lebanon. These areas have been very economically important to them for a very long time. Tentatively, Egypt is reaching out for, are there any hints of rebellion that we can maybe support? We can give some money, some weapons, military support, kind of behind-the-scenes maneuvering that exposes Egypt itself to relatively small risk, but might undermine Assyrian rule in this region and give them an excuse to sweep in and claim it themselves. Elam, out in the Iranian plateau, is thinking the same thing and is kind of tentatively probing Babylon. Remember, Babylon is currently part of the Assyrian Empire, thanks to Tiglath-Pileser III. The Babylonian nationalism runs pretty strong, and the Assyrians at this point were not willing to treat Babylon too harshly and try to deport populations just yet. the seems perhaps a little too historically and religiously significant to try that just yet. So Elam is probing to see, well, can we support a revolt here? Maybe we can slip a candidate for king in. We need a revolution or something against the Assyrians. So those two's happen. There's not just ambition in politics. Tiglath-Pileser's campaigns across this region had brought under Assyrian control many of the historical trade routes that crisscrossed the Middle East, which means that both Egypt and Elam are economically threatened by this. Egypt has lost access to the cedar forests of Lebanon, which not a lot of sources of timber in Egypt. They're going to import pretty much all of it. And right now, there's not a lot of options for that, which is a big deal. And Elam depends upon the trade routes through Babylon for bronze. That's cut off as well. And the Assyrians were certainly not too eager to trade with an old enemy. So a combination, again, politics, ambitions, sort of a historical sense of empire and significance, combined with a legitimate economic threat to these kingdoms' survival, ultimately leads them to join hands together against Assyria to form an alliance. The kingdom of Urartu up in Caucasus and the Armenian region was like, we'd like to do this too. Now, Urartu wasn't directly threatened in the same way, but they've clashed with the Assyrians for generations at this point. They're eager for some revenge. So what this essentially means is Assyria currently is surrounded by enemies on its west, east, and north. The three enemies, not only reasonably powerful, but are now working together with the expressed goal of defeating or humbling the Assyrians in some way. That is a pretty significant threat, and if a two-front war is bad, a three-front war is worse. Now, nonetheless, Sargon has a little bit of breathing room here because none of these groups are quite willing to go to war just yet. They're still not sure of themselves, and if nothing else, Assyria's fearsome reputation loomed very large. I suppose if nothing else, the Assyrian kings who had very carefully cultivated a reputation of military power and brutality had done their work well. So instead they returned to the old tradition of trying to support revolts. Around the year 720, so about 2 years into Sargon II's reign, the first of these revolts happens. Now the ties themselves aren't super clear from historical records, but it seems as if the Elamites begin to support a rival claimant to the throne of Babylon, a Chaldean. If you recall, the Chaldeans are a tribe that they were referred to, who ruled the Sealand region in southern Mesopotamia, and were seen as having a somewhat legitimate claim to Babylon itself. A Chaldean king known as Marduk-apel-iddina staked his claim to the throne of Babylon, and with Elamite support, stirred up a revolt in Babylon, and with the support of his own people in the south, he took the city and crowned himself king of Babylon. Sargon, of course, immediately raced down to face him in war, and was defeated. And in fact, it was such a humiliating defeat that Sargon forbade anyone to speak of it. It would take actually 10 years before the Assyrians actually managed to wage a successful campaign and retake Babylon, throw this rebel out, and place the Assyrian king back upon his proper throne. Unfortunately, if the Assyrians thought that was the extent of it, they were wrong. At the same time that Marduk-apel-iddina is seizing control of Babylon, a major revolt breaks out among the Phoenician and Syrian cities. This is probably supported by Egypt, and we know this through some accounts and records we find among the Egyptians, and there's some pretty strong evidence that Egypt is giving at least money to these people, bribing them and encouraging them in this regard. Now, this revolt, as well as a later revolt in 712 B.C.E., were both defeated, though it does help to explain why the Babylonian campaign was a failure. The Assyrians were distracted elsewhere, and in the grand scheme of things, the Syrian cities were probably a little more important economically than Babylon was. Babylon's more of a symbolic victory in a lot of ways. This only really stops because around the same time, around 712, when the second revolt is defeated, a pharaoh who is a little more friendly to Assyria comes to power, known as Sabaco of Nubia, one of the Nubian pharaohs of Egypt. Sabaco doesn't break the alliance with Urartu and Elam, but does stop supporting rebels in Syria, thus calming the Western Front down just a little bit, which I'm sure Sargon II was, at least in private, quite grateful for. While this is happening, other campaigns are occurring as well. During the same time frame, in the years 719 and 715 BCE, the king of Urartu in the north, Rusas I, uses Assyria's preoccupation with Babylon and Syria to begin slowly extending his control south, and his armies push into the Zagros Mountains and part of northwestern Iran. Well, they don't annex these regions directly, he's able to depose a lot of essentially puppet rulers that the Assyrians had installed among small kingdoms and local tribes there, and basically turn this northern Assyrian frontier into a new Urartian frontier, which was considered a major threat to Assyria, and one that Sargon certainly wasn't going to take lying down. So between his second campaign in Babylon and the second Syrian revolt in 714 BCE, the Assyrians march in force against Urartu, crossing what we call the Kurdistan region, and perhaps reaching as far north as Lake Van in ancient Armenia to fight the Urartans. And by all accounts, this is a very successful war. And it's interesting, no one really expected it, with the three-part alliance threatening Assyria, and Urartu being, without a doubt, the strongest of the three. I imagine Rusas I probably thought that Sargon wouldn't dare expose his borders to his weaker foe to attack his strongest foe. To quote a phrase I heard once, that's like disarming a mugger by punching him in the knife. But nonetheless, this daring act and this overwhelming force wins a crushing victory over the forces of Urartu, and in fact, a number of their cities were overrun and conquered, large numbers of people captured and killed. It was a major victory for Sargon, but not a total one. Even though Urartu is pushed back into its core territories, even though in despair Rusas I takes his own life, core cities are not conquered. The capital is not conquered, and Urartu will continue to encourage revolts among the Neo-Hittites for years to come, thus prompting future Assyrian campaigns in this region. At the same time, a minor point now, but one that will play a larger role later, a new player enters the game in these northern wars. A minor state in Anatolia, known as the Phrygian Kingdom, will actually play a role for the first time. As the future goes on, they're going to be a much more important power player in that region. Will also have a role to play in future Greek history, though that's a few centuries down the road. Nonetheless, by 710 BCE, despite all these difficulties, Sargon has effectively dealt with all of his major rivals. Urartu has been humbled and thrown back out of the Marcher states. Egypt is at least nominally friendly at this point, or at least not willing to launch major expeditions or major campaigns against them. And Elam was driven back when the Babylonian king Marduk-apal-iddina fled to Elam, and Babylon once again falls back into Assyrian control. With this, Sargon once again proclaims himself the king of Babylon, the king of Sumer and Akkad, and the king of the whole country, even if the Sealand remains largely independent from him, and a number of surrounding minor states, like the figure that is mentioned, the island of Cyprus, and as far south on the Gulf as modern Bahrain, all offer tribute to Sargon in proclamation of his glory and probably in hopes of avoiding his attention. Like Assur-Nazir-Pal before him, Sargon chose to cap off his achievements by constructing a new capital. Just west of Nineveh, he ordered the building of a new city called Dur-Shurukin, Fortress of Sargon, essentially. We know from archaeological excavations there that a number of grand palaces and major fortifications were constructed upon this site. But in an irony, much like Tiglath-Pileser before him, Sargon ends up dying about a year after his great achievements, and by the time Dur-Shurukin opens for business, the king is dead. They don't abandon the city, and in fact there's a governor assigned to it for years, and it remains part of the imperial domain, as it were. But it's a little more than a minor regional center for the rest of Assyrian history, and by the very end of Neo-Assyria, the city is largely abandoned, and will be mostly a forgotten little vanity project of Sargon II.
Though Sargon II, true to form, did not die in his bed, an old sick man, he actually died at Tabal in 705 BCE at the age of 60. He was fighting the Neo-Hittites in the region, supposedly died in battle against the armies of Girdi the Kulumayan. After the battle, his body was never recovered.
Unlike Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon was able to establish his dynasty on a firmer footing, and upon his death, around the year 704 BCE, he leaves power in the hands of his son Sennacherib. Sennacherib assumes power around the year 704 BCE, and thanks to the glorious victories of his father, he inherits a relatively calm kingdom. For at least a few years, there are no major challenges to his reign, and he's able to conduct a few minor campaigns, mostly into the Zagros, to again re-impress upon the tribes there that it was Assyria and not Urartu to whom they owe their allegiance. We also know that a tribal group who have been moving into the Caucasus region called the Sumerians for some time also seem to have, if not revolted outright, at at least made some moves in that direction, and Sennacherib chose to, again, teach them the price of disobedience. But sometime between 703 and 701 BCE, a series of intrigues and revolts occur, which will draw Sennacherib into a series of major wars, which will pretty much dominate the rest of his reign. Again, around the year 701 BCE, a major revolt breaks out along the Mediterranean coast. As far as we know, the cities of Sidon and Ascalon, along with the kingdoms of Judah and Ekron, had joined together into an alliance to throw off Assyrian control and refuse to pay tribute. We also know that by this point, Sabako is no longer Pharaoh of Egypt. He's long dead at this point, and Egypt is once again supporting these revolts financially and militarily. There's evidence that at least some Egyptian troops were sent to support these rebellions. Much like previous rebellions in this region, the Assyrians march in force, and Sennacherib is able to crush this revolt relatively easily. And indeed, there's a number of inscriptions where Sennacherib supposedly mocks the rebels for trusting in the quote-unquote bruised reed of Egypt for support. In fact, the only city that was part of this revolt to survive without serious sieges is actually the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was besieged. In fact, there's a reference in the second book of Kings to this, related to Isaiah the prophet, who supposedly encouraged the king of Jerusalem, Hezekiah, to resist the Assyrians and refuse to open the gates to them. We don't know how true that is, but we do know from Assyrian accounts that the siege was ended via diplomacy rather than bloodshed. In this case, because Hezekiah agreed to pay a truly ruinous tribute to the Assyrians to spare the city. According to official Assyrian accounts, 30 talents of gold, 800 talents of silver, all kinds of valuable treasures, as well as the king's daughters, harem, and musicians. One assumes they all went back to the capital to entertain their new Assyrian overlord, but one can't be certain. There's evidence that Sennacherib seriously considered actually launching a direct campaign against Egypt in retaliation for this sport. And there are some sort of semi-legendary accounts that supposedly the Assyrians were massing forces along the Mediterranean coast for this, but there's really not any extant Assyrian records to support this, and most think it's probably confusing him with his successor, who actually will launch some campaigns against Egypt. Of course, around the same time that this coalition begins to make waves in Syria, Sargon's old friend Marduk-apel-iddina, who had survived his uprising and fled to Elam, decides to come back from exile and claim his throne once more, and for a second time, with Elamite support, he stirs up trouble, reclaims his throne in the Sealand, and with his allies, reclaims Babylon, crowns himself king once more, and basically defeats the various Assyrian puppets and garrisons left to control that region. Again, the exact year isn't actually known, but sometime between 703 and 701 BCE, Sennacherib moves against Marduk-apel-iddina, and the two forces meet at Kish. That's where the two armies clash, and by all accounts, the Assyrians win this, although it is a hard battle by most contemporary accounts. But proving that he had the luck of something on his side, Marduk-apel-iddina survives a second time. This time, however, he flees to the south and basically tries to reestablish a kingdom in exile in the Sealand. He's only partly successful in doing this, but it's telling to note that the Assyrians never actually catch him, and so he continues to stir up trouble in Mesopotamia from his southern bastions there. Sennacherib decides that Babylon perhaps needs to be taught a bit of a lesson in this regard, and so he not only allows his troops to loot it, something that Sargon II had not allowed, he also orders around 200,000 people deported from the city and scattered throughout Assyria, following the old traditions dating all the way back to Tiglath-Pileser at this point, and even further actually. A man named Bel-Ibini, a largely unknown figure who was very clearly an Assyrian puppet king, is placed on the throne. I guess Sennacherib thought that maybe making himself king of Babylon was a step too far. If he's propped of a Babylonian puppet, that might make things a little easier to deal with, a little calmer. If he was hoping that, it did not succeed, at least not in the long term. In the short term, though, it seems to work. around 694 BCE, fearing perhaps that Elam was continuing to support the intrigues of Marduk-apal-Iddina, Sennacherib sends an army into the Sealand. It also swings eastward against Elam itself, and he defeats several Elamite armies, captures some territory in the Iranian plateau, and finally, Marduk-apal-Iddina meets his destiny and dies, leading back into Elam once again. Thus, I'm sure, as far as Sennacherib was concerned, the problem has been solved forever. If by forever you mean a couple of months. Because in retribution for these attacks and for having his own lands ravaged, the king of Elam, Halushu, decides that, well, if the Assyrians want to play rough, I'm more than happy to play rough with them. He sends an army against Babylon, with the rather probably popular idea of I will liberate you from Assyria and remove this puppet king who rules over you. The Babylonians rose up in revolt and joined Halushu's armies in this. This gets messy. It seems like the Assyrians were fighting, the Elamites were fighting, the Babylonians were rebelling at the same time. It looks like the puppet king that Elam hoped to put in power dies at some point in this, and so the Babylonians actually will place their own king on the throne. Another Chaldean, a man named Mushazib-Marduk, becomes the king of Babylon, another Chaldean prince. The Elamites decide, good enough, and they throw some support and give him some troops to garrison his city with, and he's like, yep, I'm king of Babylon, problem has been solved forever, if by forever you mean a couple of years. In 689 BCE, Sennacherib chooses to retaliate against Babylon with incredible fury. By all accounts, not only are Mushazib-Marduk's forces defeated in battle, not only is the king killed and Babylon taken by storm, Sennacherib decides that the Babylonians clearly need to be taught a lesson, and he orders his troops to sack the city. This is not just a simple looting like we saw previously. No, this is a much more complete sacking. As far as we know, temples and palaces were torn down, the walls were destroyed, troops set fire to the houses there, and the entire city was not only looted, the statues of the gods were taken, and the temples were desecrated to basically destroy Babylon as a city. To quote Sennacherib, who was quite proud of this achievement in his own inscription, as a hurricane proceeds, I attacked, and like a storm, I overthrew its inhabitants, young and old. I did not spare, and with their corpses I filled the streets. The town itself and its houses, from their foundations to their roofs, I devastated by fire, in order that in the future even the soil of its temples be forgotten. By water I ravaged it and turned its lands to pastures. To quiet the heart of Ashur, my lord, that people should bow in submission before his exalted might, I removed the dust of Babylon as presents to the most distant peoples, and in the temple of the New Year festival at Ashur I stored some in a jar. Essentially taking sacred earth from the temple's fields, giving it out as a prize to prove he had done it, and then storing some in the temple of the war god in Assyria, again as proof of his triumph. As we've mentioned several times, the Assyrians were a brutal people who enjoyed war and didn't really see a problem with making rough, bloody examples of those who rebelled against their authority. Babylon still held a certain mythic status in Middle Eastern culture, and even the Assyrians were somewhat uncomfortable with what he had done. Sacking the city? Fine. Deporting the population? Okay. Holding the gods hostage? That's a tradition in Mesopotamia. But having the city burned and desecrated? That was seen as a grave insult to the heavens. After all, Babylon means gate of the god in the ancient tongue. And many people thought that Sennacherib might have brought a curse down upon himself with this. There was a lot of, shall we say, political maneuverings to maybe get rid of this cursed king. 8 years later or so, he does die. In fact, by most accounts, he is assassinated by one of his sons, or at least by some disgruntled courtier. And many thought that that was probably rightly divine punishment for what he had done. Sennacherib dies in 681 BCE, murdered either by rivals or by the gods, depending on who you believe, and he is succeeded by his eldest son, Esarhaddon, who will reign until about 668 BCE. Now, interestingly enough, Esarhaddon was actually in exile at the time. He'd been cast out of Assyria by Sennacherib some years earlier. And in his official accounts and histories, Esarhaddon claims that he was so beloved by his father that his brothers jealously intrigued against him and poisoned his father's mind with lies and convinced the king to drive his loyal son into exile. and that thus, upon Sennacherib's death, he righteously returned to Assyria to reclaim from his traitorous brothers what was rightfully his. I call bull for a couple of reasons on this. One, we don't really know the circumstances of his exile exactly, so who knows what he did or is supposed to have done. But he was in Assyria awfully quickly after Sennacherib had died, and he immediately moved to consolidate power, and there's no phones and no internet, which means that if he was really living beyond the borders of the empire, how did news get to him that quickly unless he knew what was about to happen? I'm pretty confident that Esarhaddon organized the assassination and positioned himself to benefit from it, but I guess that is just a conspiracy theory. Still, common sense. Esarhaddon understood exactly the problem, that he needed to recapture essentially public relations and put this whole curse of Babylon thing to rest, to show that he would be a righteous and upright and faithful monarch, and he would undo the stain upon the reign of his dynasty that his father had so unwisely incurred. And so immediately he announces that he, out of his own personal funds, which means Assyria's funds, is going to have Babylon rebuilt and reconsecrated and restored to its former glory, which, was met with a lot of actual relief and some celebration by the Babylonians and by the Assyrians as well, who thought that, okay, good, we're going to make sure the gods don't get angry at us and smite us all. The problem was that not long after Babylon's destruction, priests of Marduk, who were living in exile, though by many accounts Babylon was not as thoroughly destroyed as Sennacherib claimed, so they might have still been there. But supposedly they claimed that in anger over what had been done to his city, Marduk cursed the very earth upon which Babylon was built and commanded it to lay fallow for 70 years to purify the evil that had been done to him. Esarhaddon was not going to wait 70 years, and so he supposedly went to the priests as a penitent and begged them to intercede with Marduk upon his behalf, to see the purity of his grief and his desire to restore Babylon. And behind the scenes, after a suitable gift of gold and silver, the priests agreed to reconsult the Book of Fate. And according to the edict they laid down, Marduk was moved by the king's piety and treasure and agreed to commute the sentence to 11 years. Why 11, you might ask? Well, it's just a curious little thing of cuneiform. If you take the cuneiform number for 70 and flip it upside down, it becomes 11. Same way 6 becomes 9, or 9 becomes 6 here in the Arabic numerals. And so, to use the language of the time, Marduk flipped the Book of Fate over, thus reversing 70 into 11 and allowing everyone to save face. And remember, it's been 8 years since the destruction already, so that's a perfectly reasonable amount of time for Esarhaddon to wait. Nonetheless, despite some of the shadiness that was going on here, Esarhaddon did a very good job, again, of recapturing sympathy and calming people down, and at least during his reign, the Babylonians would in fact be fairly loyal subjects, shockingly enough. Of course, Esarhaddon's a busy king. He doesn't have time to reorganize the reconstruction of the city. He mostly leaves that in the hand of his mother and his wife, who will oversee it. Again, to link back to part 1 of this episode, when we think part of the legend of Semiramis might come, suppose she built Babylon, it probably comes to the queen mother of this period rebuilding Babylon or overseeing that. While Babylon, which would take a while to rebuild, but Babylon would be rebuilt to its former glory, the statues of the gods returned, a suitable puppet king installed who was grateful for his throne, other regions of the empire are less secure. Around 677 B.C.E., as Esarhaddon is involved in these reconstruction projects, the Phoenician city-states, led by the king of the city of Sidon, revolt once again. And the reason for that is actually fairly simple. The Assyrians had forbidden the Phoenicians to trade with Egypt and to trade with, I think it was Cyprus, which were their two biggest clients, which basically means the Phoenicians, who, if you might be familiar with them, are basically a merchant republic in a very real sense, are basically going bankrupt because they're the lifeblood of their nation, their city-states, their ocean trade has been cut off. And so, in desperation and rapidly losing market share to the Greek city-states, the Phoenicians rise up in revolt and hope somehow to win. Again, they're probably hoping that Egypt will lend support. We're not sure if they do or not. What we do know is that Esarhaddon responds swiftly and brutally, and not only are the Phoenicians defeated, the city of Sidon is completely destroyed, its inhabitants enslaved or deported, and its lands given to the nearby city of Tyre, which will play a major role in this region for centuries to come. At the same time this is happening, we also see a series of disruptions in the north, this time not led by Urartu, but rather caused by the migration of the Scythian horse tribes into this region, who were displacing the Cimmerians and pushing the Cimmerian tribes into Assyrian territory. For example of this, it's very similar to what was happening in late Roman times when the Huns were pushing the Germanic tribes westward into Roman territory, taking conflicts there. And the Cimmerians begin essentially raiding and fighting in Anatolia, and these cities and Neo-Hittite kingdoms in and around Cilicia, who feel that Assyria is not really protecting them from this menace, even though they're paying tribute. In desperation, they revolt as well, in hopes of, I really don't know what they were hoping to do there, because now you've got the Assyrians angry in the south, and the Cimmerians angry in the north, and things were going to end well for them either, unfortunately. Much like it happened to the Phoenicians, Esarhaddon leads a swift military campaign, crushes the rebels, reconquers the cities, and once again extracts tribute and captives from them. By a quirk of fate, though, unlike the Romans, who had to fight the Huns next, the Scythians basically end up turning the Cimmerians into vassal tribes, then turn westward to fight the Phrygians and the Greeks, thus basically leaving the Assyrians alone and that border unmolested. We strongly suspect the kingdom of Urartu might have actually encouraged this in hopes of pushing them away from their own borders, but not a lot of strong evidence there either way. Indeed, Esarhaddon actually goes so far as to approach the Cimmerians and actually offering an alliance and a royal marriage among their strongest leader in order to basically make them pseudo-allies of Assyria, which I'm sure everyone's like, the barbarian horse nomads and the Assyrians are allies now. This can't end well for anyone involved. Unfortunately, while Esarhaddon was able to maintain control of his western territories and the north ended up working out very well for him with his new alliance, in the east, in the Iranian plateau, things are going a little more poorly. The Medes, who have been on and off consolidating control over Iran for a couple of centuries now, are really beginning to pick up steam in this period and basically are systematically removing Assyrian influence in this region and replacing it with their own, basically bringing this entire territory under their control, which within a couple of decades they will succeed in doing. Then they will become a major threat to Assyria. Now, not only is this a long-term threat because the Medes are a powerful state, potentially very dangerous rivals to Assyria, remember the Assyrian military relied very heavily upon cavalry as part of its tactics. And guess where most of its horses came from? Iran. Who controls that now? The Medes. Who's not trading horses anymore? The Medes. Which means that in the long term, the Assyrian army will actually begin to lose access to the quality horses they had relied upon for years to come. Again, to draw a more modern parallel, one of the death knells of the Byzantine Empire was losing access to the horse grazing lands in Turkey. Same sort of thing is happening here.
In addition to losing the horse-rich lands in the Iranian plateau, much of the areas they fought over with Urartu, those areas bordering that region, also were decent lands with horses being paid tribute. When the Assyrians demand tribute from many of these states, they would often demand them in local resources which the Assyrians could find valuable, not merely in things like silk and gems and gold, but the use of horses from the Urartu tribute allowed them to stock their cavalry and use it for a number of other imperial purposes, which more or less meant that if these regions revolted, especially if they revolted in which other regions revolted, like, say, for example, Phoenicia, which had some of the most economic power in the empire given its vast trade networks it was beginning to build and its overseas colonies it would develop. As these various regions went to revolt, and Assyria could not call upon those resources because they were refusing tribute, because they were directly in opposition, wherever the case may be, Assyria knew it had to force these rebellious vassals to come back under the fold. It had to make an example out of them, because if enough areas revolted at once, the empire would be unable to sponsor its armies, would be unable to actually respond in any meaningful fashion. And the fear was that if Assyria could not maintain its dominant, fearsome military position, if it could not intimidate all of its vassals to remain in line, that it could quickly spiral out of control. The same scenario that happened to the greater region when the collapse occurred could occur in the empire. If they lost access to the horses, they would be unable to maintain their powerful army. They'd be unable to force an area like Phoenicia to be obedient. With the loss of Phoenicia's wealth, they couldn't continue to force loyalty on Babylon, etc., etc. Essentially, the head of the Assyrian Empire, the army, the emperor, the high officials, dignitaries, and lords, they realized that allowing one rebellious vassal to break away, allowing one region to be beyond their control would mean that all of the others would continue doing the same thing. And with an empire so vastly overstretched, you're looking at a scenario where just a little bit of tension could unravel the whole tapestry.
As far as we know, the Assyrians pushed back against this, as you'd expect. Military campaigns were launched, but most of these were raids. They claimed victories, they claimed tribute, but as far as we could tell, they were never actually able to claim any of the fortified cities of the Medes, and thus, in practice, their influence continued to wane in Iran as time went on. Well, despite all this, though, Esarhaddon was feeling pretty confident, and in 671, he decided to launch perhaps the grandest of his grand campaign. He decided to take the biggest prize that many Assyrian kings had dreamed of ruling, but no one had ever dared try. He decided to conquer Egypt. In a very real sense, all of Esarhaddon's wars were building up to this. You can say he was securing his frontiers in preparation for a serious push with the majority of his forces elsewhere. And thanks to his alliance with the Sumerians, thus keeping pressure on Urartu in the north stable, he was in a position to do that finally. And so Esarhaddon began to mobilize forces in late 672 BC and began to make a show of force all throughout the Syria-Palestine region. He once again reminded the Phoenicians who they owed tribute to, showing a force to make sure that no one gets any crazy ideas why he's going to do this. He's also building preliminary camps and setting up logistics, stockpiles, everything ready, because the Assyrians don't actually know a whole lot about Egypt. They know where it is and how to get there, but they don't know how strong it is. They don't really know a lot about the geography. It's kind of unknown territory as far as they're concerned. In the winter of 672, as he's building this up, Esarhaddon also sends a few diplomatic expeditions into Arabia, making contact with a number of Arabian tribes. Flattering them with gifts, he actually gains their military support. It will be Arabian scouts who will lead the Assyrian army across the Sinai Peninsula. In spring of 671, Esarhaddon felt ready, and with the king personally leading them, his troops cross the Sinai. By all accounts, he crosses it in about 11 days, which is a lot better than 40 years, and strikes into the delta. The Assyrians have been gearing up for a major fight. Like, Egypt had the reputation of being, the wealthiest, the strongest, the most powerful nation in ancient days. It had been a thorn in their side since the beginning as far as they were concerned. They thought this would be the harshest, most difficult campaign they had ever waged. The delta falls almost immediately. The Nubian dynasty of pharaohs actually went through a period of weakness in this time, and most of they're called nomarchs, the various nobles who rule the delta for the pharaoh, don't really put up much actual resistance. They decide that they're fine with accepting their Assyrian overlords and switching their allegiance to the new king because they're not confident the pharaoh can protect them, and they were good to not be confident because by the end of the year, the Assyrians will have pushed all the way to the city of Memphis, which they take by siege, and the pharaoh at the time, Taharka, flees south to Thebes and tries to organize resistance. In fact, on and off, the Assyrians will be fighting in Egypt for the next 2 years. Although, again, due to a quirk of history, they almost do. In 669 BCE, when the Assyrians are pretty confident that they have secured control of Egypt, that this impotent pharaoh is launching little stings from Thebes that can't seriously challenge us, with the wealth of Egypt behind him, the exiled pharaoh was able to convince the various lords of the north to rebel against the Assyrians, and he actually launches a campaign, retakes the city of Memphis, and it looks like we're going to reclaim Egypt. Esarhaddon gets word of this. He is outraged that his generals have failed him so drastically, and he races westward to once again teach this upstart pharaoh who the true king of kings was. By all accounts, en route to Egypt, he dies. Once again, Syrian kings have a nasty habit of dying in the middle of major affairs. However, Esarhaddon had prepared very carefully for this. He wanted to make sure there'd be no problems upon his death, and so he had, several years beforehand, brought his most powerful nobles and vassals together in Nimrud, and he had basically laid down the succession and forced them to swear allegiance to this. The problem was the scheme that Esarhaddon chose is kind of a weird one. He decides to split succession. His eldest son will rule his empire as Ashurbanipal, but one of his younger sons will be made the king of Babylon. Now, according to the papers he drew up, the younger king of Babylon will be a subordinate vassal to his elder brother. This was not a division of the empire, but there's an old saying in monarchies that power is shared best when shared least, and I think we all see where this is going. Nonetheless, for a number of years, it was stable, largely because the Queen Mother was actually able to mediate between the two brothers and keep the peace and stability in Assyria for a time. Immediately upon his succession in 668 BCE, Ashurbanipal decides that he cannot allow the insult done to his father by Egypt to stand. And so once again, he marshals his armies and personally leads them into Egypt to teach the Pharaoh Taharqa a lesson he will never soon get. History repeats itself in a rather ironic fashion. As soon as the Assyrian armies enter the Delta, the lords of the Delta trip over themselves to surrender, and once again, the northern parts of Egypt fall under Assyrian control relatively easily. Despite this, however, is a symptom of just how overstretched Assyria is becoming in this period, because you would expect Ashurbanipal to just massacre the rebels and just inflict horrific torments upon them and make grand monuments to all the people he kills to teach never to revolt again. Instead, he forgives most of them and actually props one of them up, Necho, as his own candidate for pharaoh. Why? Because Ashurbanipal knew that he could not afford to keep a large garrison tied down in Egypt for years, and he was smart enough to know that the Egyptians would probably not accept Assyrian rule directly, have to work as some kind of immediate, and so he basically violates one of the Neo-Assyria's oldest policies and chooses clemency for those who had revolted against his fathers. Still, despite this, he is reasonably successful, taking Memphis once again, pushing south to Thebes, driving Taharqa into exile, where he will die in exile this time, and seemingly taking the kingdom of Egypt and propping up his own pharaoh candidate as a vassal. Everything seems to be doing great. Ashurbanipal has succeeded grandiosely, except at the same time this happens, the Phoenicians revolt again. I guess they just couldn't stand to be impoverished by their Assyrian overlords, or just hadn't learned their lesson last time, because they'll revolt twice during his reign. And so Ashurbanipal has to pull armies out of Egypt to fight Phoenicians, but he can't really pull as many troops out of the campaigns against Taharqa as he needs to, and so while the Phoenicians are defeated, once again he has to show leniency to the rebels because he cannot afford to tie his army down there. He has to accept a compromise, which I'm sure had to burn deep in his soul. And I suspect in reality, one of the major concessions he got from the rebels in exchange for clemency was use of their armies in Egypt. So there was a practical purpose to it, but again, Sargon never would have accepted that. Sennacherib certainly would have accepted that. Esarhaddon probably wouldn't have accepted that. Ashurbanipal has to accept that. Much to their own chagrin, I imagine. Things are relatively calm, though, for a few years, but in 664, Egypt revolts yet again. The son of Taharqa, Tanu-Tamun, returns from exile, takes the city of Thebes, the base, and once again sparks a rebellion. The puppet king Necho did attempt to fight this rebellion on behalf of his master. He fails dramatically and is killed in battle. Thus, basically, Egypt once again is independent. Ashurbanipal decides that mercy was clearly wasted. And so, for the third time, an Assyrian army crosses the Sinai, enters the Nile Delta. This time, however, it will be a much, much more difficult campaign, lasting almost a year. As far as we know, this time Ashurbanipal was far more successful than previous rebellions. The rebel pharaoh, Tanu-Tamun, is defeated and killed, the city of Thebes is taken by storm, and it is looted and plundered by the Assyrians. Ashurbanipal claims as his personal treasure 2 grand obelisks. If you ever know what the Washington Monument looks like, that's an obelisk. These are much smaller, though. However, these obelisks were plated in something called electrum. All you D&D nerds out there, yes, that's a real thing. It's a naturally occurring mixture of gold and silver, and according to the Assyrians' official account, their own translations of the numbers, the obelisks weighed about 28 tons. So that's a lot of treasure. The city was looted and plundered and burned, and as far as we know, Tanu-Tamun actually probably escaped into Nubia, though some count that he is killed. Hard to say exactly what happened. But for the rest, or at least for a good long while, for several decades in fact, Egypt will remain a crown jewel in the possession of the Assyrians and a source of great wealth and great power. At the same time, however, that Ashurbanipal is punishing the Egyptians and the Phoenicians for their rebellious ways, he is also attempting to launch campaigns against the Medes, pushing into Iran to try to reverse the rather bad situations occurring there. these have mixed results. In preparation for this, probably using his father's Sumerian allies, Ashurbanipal reaches out to the Scythians, and the Scythians agree to an alliance with the Assyrians, and the two work together to a point. With Scythian support, both the ability to pass through their lands without problems, and probably the support of Scythian mercenaries who are more than happy to take treasure in exchange for killing things, Ashurbanipal launches a series of attacks roughly between the years 665 and 655 into Iran against the Medes. While Scythian support allowed them to win a number of important victories, again, Ashurbanipal, though, was not able to reverse the trend. The Medes are simply too deeply entrenched in Iran at this point to be dislodged easily, and in a very real sense, probably all he's doing is convincing the Assyrians are not good neighbors and cannot be trusted. Well, the campaigns east end rather abruptly in 655 BCE when Egypt revolts yet again. This time, ironically enough, Pharaoh Psamtik, who was the son of Necho, the former Assyrian puppet pharaoh, to use a somewhat poetic phrase I have heard, raises the flag of Egyptian independence with the support of the Greeks, who send large numbers of mercenaries to support his rebellion against the Assyrians in this period. I doubt because the Greeks really cared, more because they were being paid. They are mercenaries after all. But still, one of the first real serious expeditions by the Greeks into the Middle East occurs in this period. And once again, the various Assyrian overlords and armies and garrisons are defeated, and a new, final dynasty of pharaohs is able to reestablish Egypt. And then they held their breath and they waited for the Assyrian counterattack, which never came. Ashurbanipal, whatever reason, chose not to conquer Egypt again. Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. At the same time, the Egyptians are reasserting their final phase of independence, even if they are truly a shadow of what they once were. Events are occurring in Elam, which will draw the Assyrians into one of the bitterest wars of these final years. Inside Elam, a man named Tep-Humban deposes his brother, who is the king of Elam, and establishes himself as king. The former deposed king then flees to Assyria and begs Ashurbanipal for support. This exile, or Taki, is able to convince Ashurbanipal that he would make a potentially useful ally, or at the very least a pawn in his conflicts with Elam. Tep-Humban, the current king of Elam, sends a letter to Assyria demanding that his brother be extradited to be punished for his crimes, whatever they might be. Ashurbanipal refuses, and so Elam declares war. This would become a long and bitter war, by some accounts lasting about 3 years. In it, it would see some of the bloodiest fighting the Assyrians had ever engaged in, because Ashurbanipal decided he's going to settle the question of the Elamites for good. Now, he's not 100% successful in this regard, but he is able to defeat the armies of Tep-Humban, depose him, and put a friendly king on the throne of Elam. But when he is on the cusp of potentially being able to do more, perhaps annex territory, perhaps break it up, perhaps destroy Elam, the region, his brother raises the flag of revolt as well. His brother, who's known as Shamash-shum-ukin, had reigned in Babylon as its vassal king for well over a decade at this point, and by most accounts he had been a loyal and faithful ally to his brother. But by this point, their mother is dead, and so she's no longer a moderating influence on them. And as king of Babylon, Shamash-shum-ukin began to see himself as a far more rightful ruler than his brother. He was the ruler of Babylon, after all, this great and ancient city, and one can only imagine that many Babylonian nobles and priests were more than happy to encourage his rebellion, perhaps in hopes of gaining independence themselves. And so he declares himself to be independent of his brother's rule, and a new Babylonian empire ruled by, Shamash-shum-ukin. He is supported by everyone. I'm not even joking here. The Phoenician cities, the kingdom of Judah, the Philistines, the Elamites, the Arabs, the Chaldeans, the Lydians, the Egyptians, they all recognize Shamash-shum-ukin as the rightful king of Babylon, and they all give support in one form or another. Literally, not only is Babylon in revolt, virtually all of Assyria's neighbors and a good chunk of its own vassals support this rebellion. This could have been the end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire very easily. And in fact, if these various groups had coordinated in the slightest and attacked simultaneously, it's likely Ashurbanipal would have been handily and easily defeated. But they don't. The attacks are uncoordinated and largely piecemeal, and Ashurbanipal is able to focus on one enemy at a time, practicing that oldest of strategies, divide and conquer. But even in this way, it took 4 years to put this revolt down. And while, according to most accounts, the Assyrians steadily advanced, defeating one rebel after the next, pushing the Babylonian armies back toward their core, one footstep at a time, it was bloody and long and difficult and expensive. But nonetheless, by 648 BCE, Assyrian armies stood at the gates of Babylon, and in despair, Shamash-shum-ukin committed suicide. By some accounts, he locked himself in his palace and burned it down around himself. I doubt that, if only because the palaces were constructed of stone and mud, but whatever the case may be, he dies in that year. With that, the revolt essentially ends. The remaining defenders throw open the gates in hopes of gaining what mercy they can, and Ashurbanipal triumphantly enters the city. But remembering well the lessons of his grandfather, Ashurbanipal chooses to treat Babylon lightly. He doesn't make harsh examples. He doesn't extract ruinous tribute, though he does demand reparations, choosing instead to play the public relations game by blaming all the evils of the land upon his dead brother, and thus allowing him to forgive those who had been led astray by this wicked man. He decides to install a new puppet king, known as Kandalanu, who was a fairly shadowy figure that we know relatively little about, who was, by all accounts, for the rest of his life, very obedient and submissive to the Assyrians, and thus suiting the purpose of the Assyrians quite well. However, while the war was largely over by 648, the border skirmishes with Elam and Egypt and other regions would continue for some years after this. The most difficult of these border wars, however, was in Arabia, where the Assyrian armies had to fight in the Arabian desert, which is a land that is not only bereft of things like water, is also home to the Arab tribes, who were quite adept at surviving in the desert and quite adept at hit-and-run raiding and all these other things. It was a long war, but once again, the Assyrian army worked miracles. They were able to mostly defeat and drive back this tribal coalition and secure that frontier, though the cost was truly monumental, and this particular monument to Assyrian stubbornness probably wasn't worth the effort they spent to do it. Finally, though, Ashurbanipal, in the last major campaign of his reign, turns eastward once again. After all, the Elamites that he had just defeated immediately turn around and support his brother's rebellion. He can't let that slide. And so, between the years 645 or so and 639, the Assyrians will campaign in Iran against the Elamites. Eventually, after a war even longer and more grueling than the one they just fought in Arabia, Elam is defeated. Large numbers of cities are destroyed and depopulated, and the great kingdom that had been the boogeyman of Mesopotamia for well over 1,000 years at this point is broken into pieces. Its capital looted, burned, and desecrated, and about, 2 or 3 successor kingdoms established under Assyrian vast control. Ashurbanipal returned to Nineveh in triumph. After defeating all of his enemies, after ending the war and destroying the Elamites as a threat, reconquering Babylon, humbling the Arabs, crushing the rebels among his own vassals, he celebrated in grand style, proclaiming himself the grandest of conquerors. And certainly it looks like that. By this point in his reign, Assyria, with the exception of the loss of Egypt, has never been larger. It controls more territories, more peoples, more wealth. It's allied with powerful nations like the Scythians and the Sumerians, and some of its greatest enemies like Elam are broken forever. And yet, this will be the last moment of glory for the Assyrians. The victory they had won at the cost of so much blood and so much treasure was hollow in many ways. Egypt was lost forever. Babylon still angry and brimming with ideas of independence. Syria restless, and of course the Greeks ever expanding their own mercantile empire and further pushing against the Phoenicians. Newer, more dangerous enemies sat on the horizon. The Medes had consolidated their control over Iran, and the Chaldeans continued to plot among the sea land. Ironically enough, the only allies that Assyria could call upon were the Scythians, who were fair-weather friends at best, and ironically enough, the Egyptians, who had a vested interest in the Middle East not breaking apart into chaos, and so were willing to actually support their former conquerors, since they were fairly confident Assyria could never really threaten them again. This passes purely into the realm of legend and speculation. But supposedly, at this time, a prophecy was made. A prophecy that foretold the end of the Assyrians just around the corner. And it shall come to pass that all they that look upon thee shall flee from thee, and say, Nineveh is laid waste, who will bemoan her? There shall the fire devour thee, the sword shall cut thee off. It shall eat thee up like a cankerworm. There is no healing of thy bruise. Thy wound is grievous. All that bear the bruit of thee shall clap the hands over thee, for upon whom hath not thy wickedness passed continuously? Now that's another biblical prophecy. But if it's true, if it wasn't written after the fact, as many prophecies are, it's awfully prescient. Now, upon his grand triumph, Ashurbanipal will actually reign for 12 more years. But these 12 final years of Ashurbanipal's reign are largely silent. Very few Assyrian records survive of this period. The king himself is rarely even mentioned outside of a few texts and inscriptions in the Limu lists themselves. Ironically enough, for a long time, the only real source about this time period was everyone's favorite Greek Herodotus, whose accuracy is at best debatable. Nonetheless, Herodotus, backed up by some other sources which suggest he actually is telling the truth, indicates that during this period of time, the Scythians were actually conducting massive raids across the entirety of the Middle East as far south as Egypt, and who were apparently able to ride across Assyrian lands at will without the Assyrian army raising even a finger to stop them. A symbol of just how overstretched and weak the empire is actually becoming. Around 630 B.C.E., Ashurbanipal abdicates his throne to his son Ashur-etil-ilani. Most likely, Ashurbanipal abdicates his throne to Ashur-etil-ilani around the year 630 B.C.E. We suspect he lives for about 3 more years by most official accounts, but that's a bit of guesswork. Interestingly enough, around the same time that Ashurbanipal dies in 627, Kandalanu, the vassal king of Babylon, also dies. Which, of course, if you've been paying attention, sparks a crisis in Babylon. What makes this even worse is, the general sent to sort it out, Sin-Shun-Nishar, proclaims himself king of Babylon in so doing, thus using his army to secure his own power base, which is a real problem that happens in a lot of historical nations, and even some modern ones. In response to this, another general, Sin-Shar-Ishkun, was sent, who did succeed in opposing this rebel general, and proclaims himself king of Babylon instead. So basically, the Assyrian military complex is looking a little disloyal at this period of time. It seems as if the Babylonians weren't 100% cool with this general, although they don't seem to have rebelled against him. But Ashur-etil-ilani did not send a third army, and sensing an opportunity, the Chaldeans, who'd long been intriguing against the Assyrians to reclaim Babylon for themselves, decide now is the time to strike. Neo-Babylonians, the king of Sealand, moves into this region around the year 626 BCE, and relatively easily with the support of the people of Babylon, ousts Sin-Shar-Ishkun and makes himself king of Babylon, founding what we call the Chaldean dynasty, and beginning the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which will rise to prominence in the years to come, though it will not remain prominent that long. We'll get to that in due time, I promise you. Ashur-etil-ilani, who wasn't willing to move against his rebellious general, does move against Nabu-apla-usur and attacks Babylon, and fails. In fact, as far as we can tell, Ashur-etil-ilani is killed in this war, and in a fit of irony, not only is his dynasty replaced, it's replaced by Sin-Shar-Ishkun, the rebel general. This guy basically comes back, usurps Assyria's throne, and makes himself the king of Assyria. However, despite all of this, by 616 BCE, the Chaldeans have basically entrenched themselves in Babylon. They have asserted their control over most of the historical Sumer and Akkad region, and have actually forced the Assyrians out of Nippur and occupied the city. The Neo-Babylonians are here to stay, and Sin-Shar-Ishkun is not able to do much about that. Seeing the writing on the wall, the various vassal states of Assyria begin to break away one by one. First, Syria-Palestine stops paying tribute, and the Assyrians are in no position to chastise them for their disloyalty at this point in time. Elam briefly is able to reconsolidate now that it's free of threat of Assyria, and they had hoped to actually maybe become a player again. They're immediately, however, conquered by the Medes, thus finishing their consolidation of Iran in that period. In fact, by around 615 BCE, the Medes and their main vassals, the Persians, have basically formed a very strong and, at this point, largely unknown empire in the east, which is just poised to move westward. The opportunity comes at the end of that year when the king of the Medes and the king of Neo-Babylon basically agree to form an alliance against Assyria. And by 614, this alliance is formalized by a royal marriage and kicked off by an invasion. The armies of Babylon, the armies of Media, as some call it, begin to push into the Assyrian heartland. By 612 BCE, it's becoming increasingly apparent to Sin-Shar-Ishkun that he cannot hold back this tide on his own, and so he sends a letter to Egypt begging for support. They dilly-dally, perhaps a bit too long, but eventually send a small number of troops to bolster the Assyrian army. By this point, however, it really is too little too late. By the end of 612 BCE, Sin-Shar-Ishkun is forced to flee to the west, and all of Assyria's main cities, Ashur, Nimrud, and Nineveh, are occupied, either by the Medes or by Babylon itself. Most of these centers are actually then systematically destroyed by the victors and not reoccupied. Most of them become ruins and ghost towns, the little more than legends within a generation or two, though a few do survive into later periods.
The imperial center itself has often been said to have been completely devastated. There are quotes saying that this stands out from all the rest of history and that there was no people ever systematically destroyed and forgot the way the Assyrians were. But this has inspired somewhat of a debate. Nineveh and Nimrud, which both fell into Median territory after this war, were destroyed and they were abandoned. But the old capital, Assur, fell into the Babylonian territory. And to some degree, Assur was not. Assur still had a governor, they still had people there, and in fact the Assyrian language would continue to be used for some time. Worship of the god Ashur would continue for some centuries into the future. There is a debate by a German scholar you can find on YouTube, a lecture by Harmut Kuhn. He speaks of how archaeology at Dur Katul Umu indicates that not only were these governors appointed by Babylon continuing to administer Old Assyrian territory, but it appeared to be the actual Old Assyrian elite, essentially nobles and powerful individuals of the Assyrian state, still continued to retain their position, still continued to practice their culture and influence and political clout in their old territories. Simply, they were bending the knee to yet a new ruler. By the period of some centuries later, when groups look back on the Assyrians and they seem to have forgotten when armies and kings march past these seas and do not remark on them at all, it's perhaps more mundane than we think. It's not that in every case they attempted to completely erase the memory, but when you look back at time, many things do fade. By the Assyrian period, Ur III is no longer a relevant topic that people talk about. In fact, when things are written down, like say, for example, when they speak of Abraham in the Old Testament, they refer to his home city as Ur of the Chaldeans. There is no talk of Ur's presence in the Sargonic Empire or Hammurabi or the massive Ur III bureaucracy under Shulgi. It's simply that new events have eclipsed the old and cultural memories only stretch so far. While the Assyrians were a massively important group, the damage that was done to them in these wars, and perhaps also combined with the hatred and no desire to relive or reminisce about the old glory days, left them as an empire that was simply forgotten when new things came. There is some debate as to whether there is a continuous cultural tradition from the Assyrians at this period all the way up to the modern period. After all, there is an Assyrian ethnic linguistic group that still does exist within the Levantine territories, but that is beyond the purview of what we're talking about at the moment. That debate seems to rage even today.
So sometime either in 612 or 611 BCE, Sin-Shar-Ishkun dies, and power passes into the hands of the last king of Assyria, Ashur-uballit, who is basically ruling the ragged remnants of a state, the last armies that will follow him from the few fortresses he still controls in the western fringes of their territory. Ashur-uballit tries desperately to rally support, to cajole support from the Egyptians, to rally the people to his cause, but there really wasn't much left to rally at this point. In 610 BCE, the combined forces of the Medes and the Babylonians make the final push, and Ashur-uballit is defeated. According to the Babylonians, he fled far to the west and was never heard from again. Perhaps he died nameless in the battle, his body was never recovered, or perhaps he fled into Anatolia or Greece or beyond. It's impossible to know one way or the other.
He went to go hang out at the Sheridan in Sardinia, obviously.
But whatever the case may be, with his final defeat and the loss of the final fortresses held by his army in 610, the Neo-Assyrian period officially comes to an end, and new empires stand to replace it. The Medes and the Babylonians, under the Chaldean dynasty, reach a relatively amicable settlement. The Medes claim the northern fringes of Assyria up into the foothills of Turkey, while Babylon claims the south. As far as we know, the two kingdoms agree to cooperate, division of territory seems to be reasonably peaceful, and the two continue their friendship after their common enemy is defeated. And as was said, over time the Assyrians would be quietly forgotten. To commemorate his grand victories, the new king of Babylon, Nabu-Apla-Usir, or Nabopolassar as you might know him, wrote or had written this: I slaughtered the lands of Assyria. I turned the hostile land into heaps and ruins. The Assyrian, who since distant days had rule over all the peoples, and with his heavy yoke had brought injury to the land, his feet from Akkad I turned back, his yoke I threw off. To quote George Rowe, as far as we know, no one sat upon the ruins of Nineveh to write a lamentation.
We're going to split this one into three-parter. So, come back next time to hear what happens after the fall of Assyria and the rise of Neo-Babylonia, the Chaldean dynasty. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, go check it out. And there's another 5 episodes before that if you haven't watched them yet either. Thanks for listening, and check our links for social media and other platforms.